Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Marco Del Giudice. He is Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of New Mexico. In his work, he explores a wide range of topics at the intersection of human behavior, evolution, and development. And today we're going to focus mostly our conversation on his recent book, Evolutionary Psychopathology, a Unified Approach. So, Dr. Del Giudice, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, great. So, I've been having quite a lot of evolutionary psychologists on the show. So, the first question I would like to ask you, and it is related, of course, to the title of your book, what is evolutionary psychopathology?
All right. Well, you could. That's an easy question to start with. So, evolutionary psychopathology, the way I intend it, is we're trying to figure out the origin and the logic of mental disorders. So, this has been an incredibly tricky question to answer. Actually, kind of surprisingly tough. And so even after hundreds of years of trying and models and different approaches and lots of research, it's really tried to make sense of psychopathology in a way that's satisfactory, the way that happens in other areas of medicine. So one thing that's missing from psychopathology is, I think, a grounded model of the mind and behavior. So you had attempts to make sense of mental disorders that were based on models of the mind that were not particularly good or realistic. And then there's a reaction to that, which is to stop worrying about theory, essentially, and make it a completely empirical enterprise. It's the DSM, that's one way to do that, or you can go empirical and just start analyzing correlations between symptoms and try to rebuild the whole thing from the bottom up. And what's still missing is a reasonable working model of the mind and behavior that's based on biological insights. So evolutionary psychopathology would be a way to do that. Start from what we know from evolutionary psychopathology, evolutionary genetics, evolutionary approaches to neuroscience, and then bring it together, build the foundations, and then on that try to reach an understanding of how mental disorders arise, what are they, why they happen, what vulnerability is, and then make sense of the whole thing in a way that works better than we have today.
Okay, and you said better than we have today. So, that's an interesting point there to make, because in what ways would you say that the approach that you have, evolutionary psychopathology, and what you and other people are trying to do here would improve clinical psychology and psychiatry, and at what levels? Because I guess that there are several different issues occurring in those disciplines and practices. So what would you like to say about that?
Okay. Well, there's a number of ways in which you could improve, and one is to first, and what I've been working mostly about is the classification of disorders. So part of my book is about trying to put forward a classification, a taxonomy of disorder that's based on a certain understanding of human behavior and patterns in human behavior. So that would be a good thing. And right now, this is not completely lacking in psychopathology. So it's not like we don't have an understanding of behavior, but it's a bit disconnected from models of, for example, personality traits and cognitive functions. It's particularly disconnected from what we know about development. So it's bits and pieces. And for example, people are trying right now to build so-called transdiagnostic models of psychopathology, in which you have, instead of the usual categories that a DSM have, for example, you're looking at dimensions of symptoms. This could be internalizing symptoms that have to do with anxiety, depression, negative emotionality. And then you have externalizing symptoms, where the main thing is impulsivity, disinhibition, aggression, and so forth. And then you can relate those dimensions to personality traits. For example, there's, it's not hard to find correspondence between broad dimensions of psychopathological symptoms and normal personality traits. Like you could map this on the Big Five model. The problem with that is that, so take the Big Five model of personality. So that itself is really a descriptive model. It's not a functional model of behavior and personality. It really is an empirical model that you get by factor analyzing a large number of personality items. So it has a lot of value, but it would be a mistake to think that that is a grounding. It's a functional grounding, right? It's just descriptive. So you're basically stacking one descriptive enterprise about psychopathological symptoms on another enterprise that's descriptive. And you're still left without a solid theory of why things go together the way they do, and why some processes are more prone to malfunction or function in, let's say, undesirable way than others, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, another approach that's really gaining a lot of traction is computational approaches. So I see a lot of connection. Are you familiar with the RDoC? That's the
No.
research domain criteria. That's a very ambitious project that was launched by the National Institute for Mental Health, and the idea there is really to eventually replace the DSM-based descriptive categories with something that's bottom up, starting from neurobiology and neural circuits. So the idea is you study brain functions, localized brain functions that are as specific as possibly can. For example, that could be fear, anxiety. You could have feeding processes that regulate hunger and feeding patterns, and so on and so forth. So you identify the brain basis of those. You develop scales to kind of assess the functioning of those mechanisms in behavior. So the RDoC is grounded in neurobiology. So the main focus there is on the neural circuits that, let's say, mediate those functions. And then people in computational psychiatry are working mainly from a cognitive perspective. So they use model of, say, decision making, or mathematical models or neural function to pretty much do the same thing. So isolate specific function and processes. And then the idea would be that you can at some point build a new classification system that's based on these processes and mechanisms, instead of relying on these categories that are, to some extent, they're artificial. We all know that they mix different things, together and so forth. So the question is, are those approaches going to succeed? And so far, they're generating a lot of interest in research. I have two reservations about these approaches, and one is it's really hard to build a complete theory of behavior and the mind completely from the bottom up. It's really hard, and we know already quite a bit about how different types of behaviors and functions go together. For example, I don't think most people in computational psychiatry link their work to, say, research on intelligence. So we know a lot about the structure of intelligence, cognitive abilities, and how things correlate together in a big picture. So it would be, you would think it would be useful to relate that kind of approach to this bottom-up approach, which you try to identify very specific functions and so on. That's not happening too much. And same for neurobiology and research on personality. On the other hand, one thing that's, I think, a limitation of these approaches right now, doesn't have to be, but right now I think it's a strong limitation. They tend to be a bit abstract. For example, computational models, and I'm a big fan, so I read a lot of that. So this is not a deep criticism, but the way they are deployed, they're deployed in a very, very abstract way. So you have a model in which you have some kind of decision-making process, you have some rewards, some costs, and these individuals trying to optimize some function of some kind of generic rewards and avoid punishment and so forth. So you can get some good insights from that, but it's completely lacking the specificity of, where there are different types of rewards. There are social rewards, there are, sexual rewards, some rewards that have to do with status and dominance, some rewards that do with caregiving, and I think you can make a really good case that the logic underlying these different types of goals and motivations is actually different. There's some specificity in the way you reach those goals and so forth. And if there's some of the behaviors you engage in are not just for your own. Let me say this way. So a lot of behaviors we engage in have a communicative function. So you're not just doing something to obtain X in the world. You're also signaling other people something about you, something about your intentions, and so forth. So and some symptoms, I think there's again a good case that several symptoms of psychopathology might have a communicative function instead of just a kind of personal, let's say, disconnected function and so on. So unless you embed these models into a, let's say, ecologically realistic model of what human beings are for, what are they trying to do? What are the motivations we have? How does our social structure work? How does it relate to our evolutionary history and so forth? Then I think they will remain a bit. In the end, you don't realize the potential of these approaches. So I'm all for neurobiology. I'm all for computational analysis, but it's not going to work. That would be my prediction unless you embed it into a realistic model of the organism. Just to make it a final example, the RDoC criteria, there's a very nice web page in which people are kind of updating all the circuits that make up this model and the sources of evidence for each. And the last time I checked every like 6 months ago and take a look. So for example, I don't think there is any slot in the model for sex and mating. That seems an interesting omission. Because a lot of things about organisms is ultimately about sex and mating, and of course the reason is that people who do laboratory study of animals usually don't study that kind of behavior. It's kind of not the domain. So you study fear and anxiety and defense reactions and whatever, pathfinding, feeding behavior. That's stuff on which you have thousands of studies. Not so many people are studying mating, and also because the species you're using for this kind of studies are not they're heavily kind of inbred, domesticated, so they're kind of artificial in a sense. But anyways, so there are big missing pieces from the puzzle, and an evolutionary approach, I think, really alerts you to this. You can't have a broad evolutionary approach to the mind and behavior and forget about mating. You just can't. So that would be, one nice way to start. So have a realistic picture of what the organism is about and what are the costs and benefits and so forth. This is another. We can talk more about this later, maybe. But the idea of trade-offs and the fact that behaviors have costs and benefits, and you're always in a tricky situation. There's no optimal behavior that's just good in every possible sense. That's also another good insight.
So, I guess that a very big component that we have to tackle here that's behind psychopathology is development, because, we are trying to ground things here in evolution, in evolutionary psychology, but I guess that we can't separate development from the evolutionary basis. How a particular organism, in this case us humans, evolved, and because there are certain aspects of our development that are, I wouldn't like to use the word are hardwired, but it is somewhat close to that. In your book, you, for example, at a certain point say that there are several developmental processes that are highly canalized. I think this is the term that you use. So could you explain that?
Sure. The canalization is really a general term in developmental biology, and it means that so generally speaking, developmental processes are trying to develop a certain phenotype, and there's so many ways in which things could go wrong. So as a rule, you don't want to be too sensitive to all the little details and random events that happen in the environment, fluctuations in whatever nutrients and I don't know, it could be anything, hormones and gene products, and of course, just think of a developmental process that's completely, but there can't be, there must be some structure, but it's very open to all sorts of information from, genes and the environment and so forth. It seems like a good thing, but it's probably not. Because then every little mutations or unanticipated little accident can derail the process, and you end up in a different region where the trait is not adaptive anymore. So as a rule, development, one thing it does, it just protects the development of the phenotype from noise, essentially. And that's a paradox, because you also want to be open to sources of useful information from the environment. That would be adaptive plasticity. But, the background is that plasticity per se is not necessarily a good thing, and probably mostly damaging to the organism. So there's a role for plasticity that is adaptive, but there are constraints on it. And that's pretty much what it is. So that's the general idea of canalization. And then there are regularities in human development, for sure, in terms of when different behaviors emerge, when, especially if you take like a motivational perspective, different types of motivations and goals actually kind of come online at fairly specific points. In development, there are probably some parts of development in which people are more sensitive to some factors than others, and then you have more influence of the family processes. We can talk about attachment maybe later, and what happens when your social world gets populated by peers. Not just by your parents and family, but by other people more or less from your age and so forth. So of course, then you need different goals and motivation. That's what happens. Hormonal processes. That's very important. I mean, you have puberty. There are some other hormonal transitions in middle childhood that could be relevant, or actually there's quite a bit of evidence that they are relevant for some disorders. So again, you want to integrate, though, that's the thing, you want to integrate this understanding of development within a broader picture of the goals of development. And this is something that, again, I think an evolutionary approach can do for you. And mental disorders, there's a really big database on the developmental patterns, so the age of onset of the symptoms. You can differentiate sometimes between subtypes or different versions of disorder based on the age at which they arise. And it's really exciting to begin to connect that descriptive knowledge about developmental patterns to the function of developmental processes.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, in development, I guess that there's a big aspect there that we have to explore here that has to do with motivational systems. I guess this is a big topic in development. So
yes.
Could you tell us what motivational systems are from a biological / evolutionary perspective?
Okay, well, I use that construct in the book quite a bit. And the idea of a motivational system is that, first thing is motivation is not general purpose. And that's, of course, very evolutionary, right? So you have different things you need to do in order to achieve so you can't maximize fitness directly. So you have to do things like survive, at least for a while, and then you have to get energy for your process. You need to get food. You need to avoid food that's toxic or dangerous items, and then you need to establish your place in a social network. You need to get protection from your parents. You need to compete for status in various ways. At some point you probably want to find mates and have offspring yourself. So and the idea is that each of these domains requires slightly different rules of operation. And you have to compromise between all those things because, motivation compete for your time, compete for your behavior. So the idea of motivational system is actually a very old idea. And there's a kind of funny story here. Because I just went back, but a few days ago, because I was reading Jack Panksepp. Are you familiar with his works? He's a neurobiologist, and he's been working on essentially motivational systems. That's what he calls, I think, primary affective systems. I would call, motivational systems. From a neurobiological perspective. But I was reading his book, his final book, and I discovered that William McDougall, so he was writing, he's a psychologist, was writing in the 1910s, 1920s, and he came up with a list of primary, he was calling them instincts, but he really had a motivational theory. Each of them was a system with a goal, certain behavior, certain learning mechanisms built in, and the list of McDougall's list from a century ago is very, very close to the list I provide in the book. So there's certainly, it's interesting. And the idea that a motivational system would be it's an abstract construct. So it's not like necessarily something we know how to pinpoint in the brain, but the idea is that you have some kind of goal-directed system that selects does some important functions for you. One is to select from the environment what happens to you, attract your attention, or make some things in the environment salient. And then manage the balance of behavior by negotiating probably with other systems that are worried about other salient things in the environment. So I might be hungry right now. Okay, so the idea is that I have a motivational system that mediates, feeding, and it's attracting my attention to things that are potential food items, triggering some certain kinds of thoughts and changing my physiology and adjusting my behavior, triggering some feelings, and then I hear, scary noise behind me, and there's, someone running towards me, screaming, Then you have the, other motivations taking over. So there's a balance between systems where you're competing, things that are competing for attention, and there's some kind of hierarchy or some kind of regulation. So motivational systems give you broad goals, and the idea is that those systems are kind of constantly working from the moment they come online, monitoring your situation, your environment for whether your goals have been reached or not, how far you are from. It's kind of, and the idea is that of a kind of cybernetic system, right? There's kind of feedback regulation or some kind of proactive regulation, but you're trying to reach some goals. You have a sense of whether the goals are getting closer or farther away, and you get certain behaviors that are generally useful to reach those goals that are deployed with more probability when the system is activated. And then if you actually are able to reach the goals and you get some reward, but again, rewards tend to be very specific in this view. It's not any reward will do. Each system wants, a certain thing. So if, for example, if I take the attachment system, which we understand very well because there's been a lot of research, infants and children have a very strong motivation to keep the caregiver available. Mm-hmm. Could be physically close, that's usually, especially at the beginning, but then especially as children grow older, physical proximity is still important, but it can be replaced to some extent by just the knowledge that the caregiver is going to come in case of need. So the caregiver, you want availability of the caregiver. Usually nothing much happens, but when the baby or the child gets, for example, there's something scary, so they're fearful, or they feel pain, or some kind of, threatening negative emotion, then you see, this system kind of getting online and activating and triggering some behaviors, like, again, crying for attention, or trying to, solicit the attention of the caregiver and so forth. And then if the caregiver comes and comforts the child, that goes up, that ends. So you have a kind of shutting off of the system. So you can think of the systems as being in the background, and they get kind of activated when there's something particularly salient in the environment that has to do with their goal, whether a threat to the goal or an opportunity to reach the goal. And then they I mean, deactivate is a bit of a kind of abstract form, but that's what I would say when they're no longer needed. The one thing I want to say about motivational system is that they don't have to be completely hardwired. I mean, it makes sense that there is some structure, and again, you don't want to have to relearn what it takes to, say, obtain status, obtain mates, and what it means to find an attractive, So some parameters, say, take a system that regulates, say, sex and mating. Again, there will be probably some kind of innate information about attractive qualities in partners. There will be some behaviors that are fairly automatic, part of the regulation of behavior through motivational systems mediated by feelings and emotions. And then, of course, you have to learn about the specific contingencies in your environment. So you need to learn the specifics of, what is an attractive partner in your environment? What is your potential to attract an attractive partner, and you should probably adjust your behavior depending on who's your competition, what are you, what's your potential, and so on. So these systems, one of the things they do is they guide learning. They're not replacing learning. Because one misconception is that this idea of these multiple motivational systems guiding your behavior is that you're just a puppet of these, hardwired motivations that just, come on and off and pull the strings. But the idea here, even for something like, hardwired, kind of fairly hardwired like attachment responses, the children learn how the caregiver responds and they adapt their behavior to the caregiver. For example, some children start by crying a lot, trying to attract the attention, and when it becomes clear that the caregiver is not responding to that, maybe because the caregiver gets actually irritated by the crying, and now the child learns to keep a distance. And now there's still an attachment, activation and attachment behaviors, but they change in quality and they become more, subtle, and you try to find a compromise. So learning is not an alternative, I think, to this idea of motivational systems. It's actually, motivational systems are what enable learning to be adaptive in context, but without losing track of the big motivations of the organism.
Since you're referring to attachment, let me just ask you right away another question about it. Because, there's attachment theory that comes originally from John Bowlby, I think. And then, there are some general attachment styles, like secure, anxious. I don't know the others by heart, but I guess that doesn't matter here. I guess that until recently, in attachment theory, people theorize that the way by which the particular child, for example, evolved or developed a particular attachment style was because she was exposed to, for example, a certain type of parenting style. But isn't it the case that more recently people have been questioning that and saying that maybe it has much more to do with individual variation at the level of personality, for example, and that different children with different personalities react to the same kind of parenting style in different ways?
Yeah, it's so I don't think we have that figured out yet. But yeah, the way attachment theory starts, and again, Bowlby, just an interesting reminder for who's watching. One thing that was unique about John Bowlby, he was psychoanalyst, but he got really, really into the biology, the ethology of the time, and the kind of blossoming cognitive psychology. So he was you can really say that attachment theory was the first instance of kind of well-developed evolutionary psychology at the time. And then, it got really successful. So it entered the mainstream eventually, and let's say the most people who work on attachment today, they're not particularly aware or interested in the evolutionary roots. And I've done it, other people have done it. So we've been trying to argue that the field should reconnect with its kind of initial theoretical background. to make progress. But so in attachment, the initial idea is that, again, children have this a very strong motivation to keep the caregiver available. There's a survival reason to it. It's not just because there's a strong evolutionary reason, because children need protection, need to and can't survive or protect themselves from dangers by themselves. So they really need a caregiver to do this for them, and so they should have a very strong and how to say prioritized system to keep the caregiver available and get what they need from them. So originally the theory is a there's an evolutionary aspect in the goal of the attachment system, which is based on survival and avoiding dangers and so forth. But then the way in which the attachment system develops, that comes really from quite a bit from the kind of psychodynamic tradition, really is a sort of learning process. So depending on the parents' reactions and on whether the child is successful or not in negotiating the request, then the child forms internal models of the parents and the environment, and what happens when I'm in distress, what happens when I ask for help, and that guides behavior. So it's very environmental. It's a strongly environmentalist. And you find, again, especially the first studies, that's kind of there's also a kind of a dynamic here. Just the first studies of families and multiple generations of attachment between parents and children, they found very high rates of concordance. So you could predict the child's attachment styles from things about the parents, including the sensitivity of the parents or even the parents' representations about attachment. And you could make really good predictions about the child's attachment style. So that seemed to fit a very nice environmental story, and that's what you're talking about. So people have been challenging this. Actually, there's also a long history of that, because people working in and child personality actually have been challenging this since the beginning. Really, I mean, since at least the 70s and 80s, you find the first critics. So let me. If I have to summarize the kind of the state of things right now, I would say that there is evidence that children do respond to parents quite a bit, especially in the early years. And when you look at the twin studies, if you talk to Nicole Barbara, she's published on that. The behavior genetic studies on infants and young children actually don't find a strong heritable component. But that seems to increase across the lifetime. So it really looks like as children grow up, especially starting from middle childhood and then adolescence and adulthood, the connection between the early attachment and the parent's behavior and the actual attachment behaviors becomes less closely tied to the original patterns of interaction, and possibly more guided by other factors that come online. And I've done some work on sex differences, which you start to see in anxious versus avoidant attachment styles. And I've argued that you start to see those differences appearing in middle childhood, and I've suggested that some hormonal transitions that you have in middle childhood may actually be responsible, so or partly responsible for that. So anyways, I think Bowlby was probably mostly right about infancy and early childhood, although you still have some gaps. So it's not entirely, so we can't completely predict the children's attachment through the parents' behavior. And people have tried, and I think it's actually a very nice area of research. Initially, people were focused on sensitivity, so whether parents respond to distress in the child in a way that's kind of, let's say, contingent, so, matches the child's demand and it's relatively quick. And you can explain a bit of attachment security with that, but not too much. So you have this gap. It's called the transmission gap. So the idea that, the parents' representations can predict the child behavior, but what is in the parent's behavior that mediates that? And sensitivity does a little bit, but it's not everything. Then people have looked at more let's drift a bit toward theory of mind in the parents, whether the parents has a conception of the child that's mindful of the children's state and mental states and so forth, and that seems to add a little bit of prediction power, but we still can't explain the transmission. So and some people have started saying, okay, maybe it's not the behavior, it could be some genetic factors, and that's probably true. Although again, you don't see that very strongly in the twin studies. Part of the so I think it's reasonable to think that, and that links to something maybe you want to talk about, this idea of an ontogenetic adaptation. So this idea that adaptive mechanism and traits can be designed to have a shelf life. Not everything has to be adaptive all the time. So some patterns of behavior that you see in children may actually be adaptive for a relatively short time, and then they disappeared or are replaced or recycled into different functions as children grow up. One example is reflexes. Children have also, babies have all sorts of reflexes, sucking reflexes, and then you lose them. And, that's fine. It doesn't make them less adaptive, but it's just the function of the adaptation is limited to a certain stage in the life of the organism. And so for attachment, the general view in the field is that the attachment system is active. That's actually the catchphrase is from the cradle to the grave. It's powerfully online since very early on, and then it's something that you have for the rest of your life. And initially, it's directed to your parents or caregivers, and then maybe it's directed to important, like close relationship, like best friends, and then it becomes romantic partners, and so on. So, but it's the same thing, doing similar things across the lifespan. And even if that is true, I think there's a good, I think it's true as far as it goes. It doesn't mean that the system has to work in the exact same way from the cradle to the grave. And if the costs and benefits and the goals change across the lifespan, you would expect selection to design the system to have, behave in a certain way early on, and maybe then switch gears and behave in different ways. For example, just it makes sense that a child would respond closely to the behavior of the parents. So that doesn't seem bizarre to me. Right, the fact that children would be, because they really need the parents to be as available as possible, but without mismanaging the relationship. So you could think that babies would be attuned to respond to their parents in a pretty close way in terms of attachment behaviors. But as children become more autonomous, right? So they're not completely dependent on parents. They can protect themselves to some extent. They can move around. They start to have other social relationships. There's actually less of a rationale for being so closely tied to your specific parent's behavior. And then when you move to romantic partners, well, you have all sorts of other problems that you have to manage. And so the idea that whatever your parents did to you, or the kind of relationship you had with your parents, are the template for dealing with your romantic partners. I mean, I'm not saying yes or no, but the idea that it would track the parents' behavior so closely, it starts to make a bit less sense. So why would that be useful? And Bowlby really wasn't so much, I mean, he had a really good theory of children and the survival function of attachment. He didn't really develop a functional theory of attachment in couple relationships, because then you have to, it intersects with mating, and a different set of problems and cost and benefits come online. So that's my argument. So and you would think that would be reflected in, for example, the role of let's say genetics or hormonal factors across the lifespan. So I've been very rambling in this, but I have an entire line of work on attachment, so I tend to get excited about it. So to answer your question in a compact way, I would say yes. I mean, there are reasons to challenge a pure environmental account of attachment. The newer longitudinal studies, because now and one thing is, the longitudinal study, it just took forever to run them. So you can't really fault people, say, in the 80s and early 90s, assuming that what you see in children across just a few years will just keep happening with adults. We just didn't have the data. And we actually, there were a few long-run longitudinal studies, and they took like about 20 years to complete. And when those started to get published, people were surprised because the connection between early attachment and later attachment seemed to be much weaker than people were expecting. And you saw much more change and interesting dynamics over time than people were assuming based on Bowlby's ideas and what happens in young kids. Plus, the other problem is to measure attachment, you have to use completely different methods. With babies, with infants, with children, with older children, with adults. And so there's actually a debate about whether you're actually measuring the same thing. Because you might argue, for example, people in a certain tradition of attachment would say that questionnaires really don't measure attachment in any deeper sense. And so are we measuring the same thing? When we see changes over time, is it because the behavior actually changes, or we're just measuring different things? And that's actually incredibly hard to it's very hard question to answer, because you just can't use the same methods. And people have tried in different ways, but so it's still an open question. But it's fascinating, and I think I actually think it's a big opportunity for attachment theory to kind of engage with these problems, and including behavior genetics, which is it's a challenge for most areas of psychology, really. And I'm a big advocate of facing that head on and just trying to make sense of that, all those findings.
Mm-hmm. So I guess we could say that at least at the moment it's still very complicated and we don't have a definite answer yet.
I don't think we have a definite answer. But we definitely have, more reasons to explore more broadly. Mm-hmm. Now that we have, for example, I was mentioning the longitudinal studies. I mean, there's quite a bit of longitudinal evidence right now, and you can see very clearly that early attachment patterns, there's a little bit of it that maybe transfer and predicts later on, but it's fairly weak, at least in some cases. And then there are some changes over time that seem to be regularities, so children who are disorganized early on, so you have this kind of inconsistent behaviors and this kind of slightly dissociative behaviors, they tend to form more dismissing and avoidant attachments as they go on. And what's going on there? I mean, again, we have the descriptive data, we have some, let's say, psychological models of how this happens in terms of how representations maybe change and get reorganized. We don't have a good functional theory of what's going on. And again, to the extent that attachment theory kind of reconnects with an evolutionary approach to behavior, I think there's also progress to be made.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But enough of attachment theory.
Yeah, let's now move on to another topic. Yeah. And I mean, in the broader context of evolutionary psychopathology, how do you include knowledge coming from behavioral genetics and differential susceptibility to, for example, mental disorders in this picture?
Okay. Can you be a bit more specific? What do you have?
Well, I mean, because we were just talking about developmental processes, sure. And I mean, theories associated with development, like attachment theory. Right. But when we get specifically into disciplines like behavioral genetics, then many times, because we are able to know the heritability of certain traits or how heritable certain mental conditions are, then I mean, sometimes I get the feeling that in behavioral genetics things seem to be a little bit more innate than when we talk about developmental approaches more broadly, I guess. Right.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's so it's a challenge that, I mean, I see three players here. And so you have the behavior genetic approach. You have the evolutionary theory. So you can study the genetics of some traits or behaviors. That doesn't tell you much about the function. So it's really about, mostly about just measurement, and in a simple version you can try to parse variance into whatever additive genetics versus different types of environmental sources. and then you have the theories about what is the behavior doing, why it's there, what are the functions, what are the costs and benefits. And for a long time, there's been just a big gap in between. And Plumins, I think Plumins, kind of famous textbook of behavior genetics used to have, I think, like 2 pages on evolution. And most, evolutionary psychology textbooks actually don't even have that. So you have maybe a footnote or a little paragraph on behavior genetics. So there's been a disconnect for a number of reasons we don't have to talk about, but which means that so it's useful to constrain evolutionary ideas about a trait with some notions about the genetics of the trait. It's also true that the kind of, say, heritability statistics, these kind of very broad level descriptions, are not incredibly useful in telling you something about the function of the trait or whether a certain evolutionary hypothesis is likely to be more or less correct. So just then you need to look a bit deeper. So for example, in patterns of, say, additive versus non-additive genetic variation. So whether that would be basically, let me say, how do you say this in a simple way? So additive genetic variation would be basically your genetic, the alleles that contribute to a certain trait just add up, which means that if the trait is mostly under additive influence, the children will resemble their parents on average. And non-additive means that it really depends to some extent on the interaction between different types of alleles and so forth. So it's really more about the specific combination that you have. So you may still have a trait that's under strong genetic control, but your children will not resemble you because they have different combination of alleles. So that would be the difference. And the proportion of those two sources of genetic influences actually can tell you something about the selection on the trait. So whether a trait has been, say, under strong directional selection, or there's been some other kind of pattern. And now things are getting more interesting, though, because you can start mapping the genes at a higher resolution. And for example, for some trait now, you can start weighing the role of mutations versus or rare variants versus common variants versus, let's say, mutations that are probably deleterious versus other types of alleles that are maybe functional or maybe they have some kind of cost and benefits depending on context. So now it's becoming so, and you start to see people looking at GWAS data with an evolutionary lens. So I think it's starting now. There's been a disconnect between evolutionary psychology, let's say, and behavior genetics. Part of that was probably unnecessary, not particularly, useful thing. At the same time, on the other hand, you probably didn't have, the genetics was not fine-grained enough to draw really interesting connections or to be very informative about evolution. And now people are starting to do that, and now things are getting really exciting because you can look at traits and, for example, get evidence of whether the trait has been under, say, mainly a negative selection, like for a lot of alleles that contribute to schizophrenia risk. That's what it looks. There seems to be mostly negative selection on that. On the other hand, well, one still has to be mindful of the limits of genetics, and even with with the GWAS studies and even with the models that we have that are pretty sophisticated. For example, one thing that it's almost very hard or even impossible to do right now is to detect balancing selection in the genome. You can do it when it's been so balancing selection would be that alleles that contribute to a trait are under basically variable selection depending on time. So let's say maybe it depends on, just imagine something that gives you some genes that affect your fat deposition. And maybe depending on whether there's a lot of food or people are starving, they may become more or less. And so over time it changes over different places. or it could depend on frequency. If a lot of people that, for psychopathy has been described in this way, right? You can have psychopaths can be successful when when they're among people who are not psychopaths. If everyone becomes a psychopath, then you start to have serious trouble. So it's kind of frequency-dependent hypothesis about some let's say traits linked to mental disorders. Okay, now if for personality, many evolutionary psychologists who have dealt with personality have proposed balancing selection hypothesis, essentially. The idea that extroversion can be, is a mixture of cost and benefits, and so depending on context, depending on who you are, depending on where you are, can give you a net advantage or not, or maybe it can be a bit random. It's kind of a high risk kind of strategy. So if that's the case, you expect a certain amount of balancing selection on the alleles contribute to a trait. Now the problem is we can detect it in most realistic scenarios. You can only detect it in genomic data if there's been very strong, very stable balancing selection for basically millions of years on the same alleles, and you have this kind of, so that you can detect. This kind of background, let's say balancing selection where you have, slight shifts in frequencies of many genes at the same time, and then it goes the other way. We really can't pinpoint that at the moment. So it's interesting because the genetic data are giving you a lot of information, but it's biased information because there are some patterns you can detect and some patterns you basically can't detect. And there's a danger of making assumptions based on what you can find, right? It's kind of looking under the lamppost. So anyways, I think it's really exciting. I think, there's some people, for Brendan Zitch would be one person. He's doing a lot of work that's evolutionary informed, but it's in behavior genetics. He's worked with twin studies, working with GWAS now, so it's extremely fascinating work. So this kind of another nice development that's pretty recent is to use GWAS, the GWAS data to map genetic correlations between traits. And now you can look at the genetic correlations between, say, different disorders, but not just that, you can look at correlations between disorders and, say, personality traits or developmental patterns. Like, for things like, for example, let's say puberty, puberty timing, or reproductive events, whether people have tend to have more or fewer children, and whether that's genetically associated with some personality traits, with some behavioral traits, with risk for certain disorders. So that information is incredibly valuable, and I tried to use as much as I could in writing the book. For development, now I'm circling back to your original question. So now this is where things get really tricky, because that's not a secret anymore. But a lot of the developmental theories we have don't match very well with the behavior genetics, because the factors that psychologists have emphasized, like family factors, be socioeconomic status or levels of stress within the family, or parenting styles or chaos, or those factors don't seem to act in a systematic way on behavior, at least in the long run. Yeah. So what's going on? So it's actually that is a really big question. I try to do a bit of work on it, but the thing is, right now there's a handful of people really who have a kind of conversant with the genetics, but also have a developmental focus. So that there's just a handful of people who do that, and most behavior genetics is mostly concerned with adults. There's some developmental work, but it's not necessarily linked to the developmental models. A lot of developmentalists are more or less hoping that it will go away to some extent. I'm kidding a little bit, but no, let's say the field hasn't been eager to come to terms with behavior genetics. So a lot of people are kind of ignoring it and not really dealing with the implications. And when you actually try to square them, it's really hard. And there are not many options. So one option is that actually behavior doesn't, is not that plastic. That's one answer. Actually, things don't matter Family, it seems that experience in the family are impactful and shape your behavior, but actually they don't. Again, at least in the long run. And so plasticity is not as that okay. It's possible, I guess. But also, I mean, you don't want to exaggerate that. For some traits, actually, there is some evidence of shared like family level effects. For example, antisocial behaviors, aggression. There's actually those traits actually have a bit more shared environmental determination than others. So it's not this uniform, but by and large, so that doesn't sit too well with the fact that in biology you can actually do experimental work, what you can't do in humans, right? Actually take offspring where you have some genetic information and actually put them in different situations experimentally and see, and you see a lot of evidence for plasticity. So I find it, it would be, I think, a really deeply puzzling finding that humans of all species have lost their plasticity to the environment somehow. You find plasticity in fish, in whatever, rats. They seem to be sensitive to some specific factors like predators or parental care, but humans, no, they don't. We lost, and that seems really bizarre because we have, it's not like we are isolated. I don't. It would be really strange. So how do you square that? So the other option is that this lack of systematic effects of let's say the family environment or the shared environment reflects some more complicated developmental patterns. Differential, you mentioned differential susceptibility. That's actually one possible way out of the conundrum, and the idea that children actually are different in the sense that some of them respond to some factors, some of them respond less than others. Some children maybe are for me kind of mysterious reasons right now, but actually kind of insensitive to what happens in the social environment, say, and develop in a very kind of canalized way. So that part of the story is still not enough to account for all the findings, but it's a possibility. However, that makes your models way more complicated because now you're looking for interactions and not just simple effects. So the evidence, so there is some evidence. It's not very good overall. Not for anyone's fault. It's just because you would really need huge sample sizes, and we don't have those data. So some people now, I know there's some researchers that are starting to look into that with a big genetic studies. So we might have some useful information in a while. But right now, so the theory is interesting. This idea that you have different susceptibility, and that is a trait in itself. Everything would work even better if susceptibility was itself a plastic trait. So if you're not, because one option is that you're just born sensitive or born insensitive, some genetic factor that determines whether you're going to be open to the environment or canalized. It's possible, I mean, some people have suggested, Jay Baskey and others, that actually some things like, say, prenatal exposure to stress hormones or like early exposure to stress might actually tune your sensitivity to the environment later on. Now, if that's the case, you can make it work in the sense that you can actually simulate. What I did just run some simulations, and what you do is you get some end results that are compatible with the twin studies. So it's exciting in the sense that, at least there's a scenario in which there is sensitivity to the environment, it's moderated by some personal factor, and what you get by kind of simulating this forward is compatible with the twin studies. So we're not ending up in a place that's implausible. We have to start over again. At the same time, why would evolution do that? That's the thing. So why would it be adaptive to tune your sensitivity to the environment based on your earliest experiences or some exposure to other factors? And I don't think there's any formal theory there. There's no mathematical model showing you why that would be the case. You can have some hunches, but people haven't really worked on the question. So I think so. In terms of working on the models of development in a way that's more formal, so you really need to move beyond like generic ideas and try to verify the evolutionary logic of the hypothesis you're proposing. and then making sure that what you get is actually compatible with the genetic findings. That's the way forward, and very few people are trying to go that way. But more people will, because it's becoming more and more clear that just measuring family factors or environmental factors and linking that to behavior, I mean, it's not enough. There's genetic confounds, and when you start controlling for genetics, some of them kind of go away. Sometimes it's very complicated, of course, but I think it's in a way it's very hard to tackle, but it's even more exciting to go in the next future, I guess. Yeah. And for psychopathology, that's even more important, because let's say, we will talk about this later.
Okay, so could you tell us now about the fast, slow defense model that you talk about in your book? And then I think that you also talk about the 3 different types of personality, and then you also associate them with different types of personality disorders. There are the F types, the S types, and the D types. So, I mean, could you tell us about that?
Okay, we are trying to keep that reasonably short. So, okay. So my proposal is that, and we're moving towards psychopathology more narrowly now. My proposal is that the first thing you need to build an evolutionary psychopathology that's useful and makes progress is to have a reasonably grounded model of the mind and behavior. And that means, to me, at least some ideas about what development is for, what are the main steps and phases in development, and what are the functions, what are the biological functions at each stage. You need some notion of motivation. I mean, you can't really try to build a theory of mental disorders separated from motivation. You really need a theory of motivation. And I think my kind of bet is that you need a rich theory of motivation. You don't need a theory with just a handful of because that's also the kind of a lot of mainstream research on motivation, if you're familiar with that, tends to be very conservative. So you try to find 2 or 3 big motivational themes and build everything around those. So I think a biological approach really pushes you to a much richer model, in which you have probably dozens of kind of relatively independent or interdependent systems that mediate motivations for all sorts of things, from attachment to mating to status dynamics to affiliation, cooperating with others, acquiring resources, exploration and curiosity, and so forth. So you really you need a theory of motivation that at least starts to feel as rich and nuanced as actual kind of real life behavior. So when you have that, you still don't have a good classification of it. You can use those kind of this background model to understand individual disorders. So when you look at, say, let's an easy one, say social anxiety. Everything about social anxiety disorder tells you that it's something that has to do with status dynamics. Anxiety and shame. If you look at the developmental course of this disorder, you see there's experiences of rejection and kind of loss of status in the peer group. You have its kind of characteristic trajectories that involve depression and then social retirement and so forth. And so you can start making some progress. You can ground the theory of the disorder in something functional. You can start making sense of the developmental patterns, why these disorders start peaking, for example, in middle childhood, actually, and then adolescence. This is when these kind of status competition systems actually get online and become powerful driving forces. So you can pinpoint where the vulnerability lies. You can link it to some personality traits and so on and so forth. But then you have one symptom or one disorder. And the thing, one of the problems with the DSM approach, where you try to, describe each disorder as narrowly and cleanly as you can, okay, Whether you can, that's a different question, but that's what you're trying to do. You define precise definition that has kind of reliability, and then you end up with a big list of disorders. Problem is, few people get one disorder. Most people get, multiple diagnoses are the rule, not the exception. And so what you really have to account for is not individual disorders and their individual special logic, but the fact that disorders cluster together. They share developmental patterns. They share trajectories. So sometimes you have for example, a kind of back and forth between aggression and anxiety across childhood in the development of some disorders. They tend to cluster in families. So they share. Now that you can look at this, for example, the GWAS, and look at the genetic correlations, I mean, there's no boundary. I don't know if you're following the literature, you never see a publication in which you say, okay, we looked at GWAS for this disorder, and hey, it doesn't correlate with any other. So there's always a network of correlations with a lot of other things. So that is what the kind of DSM style approach fails at. You basically end up describing individual disorders and then have to talk about comorbidity and then trace the statistics of the comorbidity, but you don't have a theory of why the comorbidity goes the way it goes. So I think one of the things that's doable at this point is to try to use your model of the mind and behavior to explain comorbidities and correlations between disorders, and that is a way to make progress concerning taxonomy. If you find actually, say, broad patterns and broad dimensions, those can be an alternative way of looking at disorders. That's okay. You can also do that with factor analysis. This is what a lot of people are doing with transdiagnostic approaches, where you just take big inventories of symptoms, big samples, try to factor analyze and find the big dimensions like internalizing, externalizing, thought disorder, psychotic symptoms, and you try to map them. You also realize that they tend to cluster in what there seems to be a kind of a general factor there. So some people seem to be predisposed to pretty much any kind of disorder. So there's some general vulnerability too we can talk about. It's very interesting. It's been exploding over the last maybe 5 or 6 years. But that's again purely empirical. And you ground it to some extent, that approach, into a theory of emotions, where you have, for example, internalizing. What are internalizing symptoms? Well, they're connected to negative emotionality. Or what are externalizing symptoms, where you can link them to a dimension of, say, disinhibition, and okay, that's still not a functional theory. What is disinhibition? What is it doing in relation with other traits? So that's what I'm saying. So you can try to recover this kind of more realistic taxonomy from a purely empirical standpoint, but you still don't have a functional explanation. So that's what the challenge. And the missing link between a general theory of behavior and this kind of taxonomy is some kind of principle that helps you organize different traits, cognitive traits, behavioral traits, personality traits, in a way that explains the covariation between traits. Mm-hmm. The way traits, so you're not just studying individual traits, individual disorders, individual symptoms, but try to make sense of why some people are in a certain way and other people are in a different way. And the way, you can do it in a number of ways. And the approach I've taken in this book and other work I'm doing is using some life history concepts as a heuristic to do that. And we probably don't want to go too deep into that, but it's not a. So a lot of people in evolutionary psychology, I think there's this kind of life history approaches have become extremely popular as a possible account for personality. Right, personality differences that kind of goes beyond just the big five or some kind of descriptive account, and gives you like a reason and a functional story for why some people tend to behave in a certain way or another. In development, it's a developmental evolutionary psychology. So it's work by Jay Besky, Bruce Ellis, myself. I've been proposing that the way to understand the role of some experiences and early factors on development is to link them to regulation of life history strategies. So that's, it's a very promising heuristic. The problem is there's a huge gaps in the theory, and and the field is actually going through a crisis right now. So as we speak, basically, because well, let's say, so this idea that you can, okay, if you look at species, I'll make it, compact. So if you look at different species and different life history traits, like, age at reproduction, you have lifespan, the number of offspring, things like that, and define kind of the investments across the lifespan, you find very, very robust patterns. And one of these patterns is this kind of fast versus slow pattern of covariation. And usually it's lots of it is small animals tend to have faster life history, so higher mortality, they mature early, they die sooner, they tend to have more offspring, not do a lot of investment in each offspring, and then as get to bigger animals, they get to a slower. But even if you control for body size, you still find these dimensions. So it's probably also something else, not just size, probably reflecting some deep conflict between allocation to different functions. And trade-offs between, say, survival at different stages of life and so forth. Okay, now that's kind of exciting because you can think, all right, we have this powerful pattern. What it does is not just explaining one thing. Let's say reproduction timing. No, it links reproduction timing to all sorts of other interesting traits. Its implication, and of course, I mean, reproduction timing, it doesn't happen. When you reproduce, is not just happening to you because you divide yourself at some point, right? for species, it means you need to engage in mating behaviors and find a partner, and then actually raise your children, make investments. So all these main life history outcomes, like again survival, reproduction, investment in the offspring, they are mediated by behaviors. They are also mediated by physiology, whether your sex hormones versus the regulation of stress hormones, how you regulate the immune system, for example, to put, say, less energy in maintaining your body for the long term versus switching some of the energy to reproduction and so forth. So potentially that, and that's where the excitement lies. If you actually could apply some of these insights to individual differences, maybe you can explain not just one trait or a little cluster of traits, but broad patterns in personality, behavior, and also physiology maybe, and developmental patterns like, say, maturation timing, puberty timing, and things like that. And that's the problem is. So, and there's some data that definitely seem to fit with this pattern. So it seems to make sense, and people are getting really excited about that. And now there's been mounting criticism for a number of reasons, and one is that you can't actually, it's not trivial to go from the level of variation across species, and just the idea that you can apply this to individual differences is actually much trickier than than people have hoped for. And we don't have actually a lot of good models, like almost any good model of that kind of transition. So it's been a bit of a shot in the dark. And then for some people have been, I think, over applying the concept. So, for example, it's tempting when you have this kind of, attachment theory has done that too. I mean, if you read the attachment literature, so the idea is attachment is this specialized system that deals with, initially caregiver availability and this kind of, regulating close relationships. And then somehow the literature now deals with everything, like, leadership, and whatever, I don't even, sports, this and that, all from, so it's easy to kind of over-apply concepts that seem to be powerful. So this life history approach, people have applied it to all sorts of traits, and sometimes without a very clear rationale or very clear, compelling evidence. So, the field has moved ahead of itself. So I kind of find myself in a very strange spot because I'm a proponent of this kind of life history approach as a heuristic. So something that can be useful to organize knowledge and make hypotheses about individual differences. But at the same time, I'm a critic of the field. because I actually do. So I'm in a weird spot in a sense. And so writing this book has been an interesting experience. So when you apply this to individual differences, my approach has been twofold. On the one hand, I tried to restrict. So it's basically I'm assuming that something like a fast versus slow continuum of life histories can be applied meaningfully to individual differences. And I actually have a paper. It's in a preprint right now. If people want to go deeper in detail, I basically try to tell the story from the bottom up. So start from scratch, and there are gaps. So it's not it's not a hard consequence of some mathematical model or some formal model. It's just, it's basically a heuristic that may or may not work. I try to restrict the application of this fast versus slow kind of dichotomy to a set of traits that seem to actually relate to life history outcomes in a pretty straightforward ways. For example, I would see impulsivity and risk-taking as personality variables. I think they are good candidates in the sense, and I see them as kind of at the center of my network of traits, because the consequences are a match. The theory in terms of earlier, if you're more impulsive or risk-taking, you are likely to reproduce earlier. If you do, it's people with these traits tend to be less investing in parental care and more, kind of say distracted by other things. They tend to be a bit more promiscuous in their mating patterns, so they put more effort in mating at the expense maybe of long-term relationships and parenting. You tend to die sooner, so there's higher mortality for all sorts of reasons. So that kind of trait, I think, you can make a solid case that it relates in meaningful way to hardcore kind of life history outcomes like mating, parenting, mortality, and so forth. And then, that's been one part of the strategy. And the idea here is that linking to psychopathology, here's the idea. You can basically you can look at individual variation in all sorts of ways and from all sorts of dimensions. This heuristic is to consider one dimension of variation that has a functional, kind of a functional meaning. This idea that there are trade-offs between, again, mostly I think mating and parenting for humans. It links to some extent to early reproduction versus later reproduction, but partly because, later reproduction is usually a good thing if you want to invest heavily in your kids. And then there's a quality versus quantity. It's all linked together. So, and I think mating parenting is kind of the main thing for humans, the way our mating and reproduction system works. And so that, I think, is an interesting way to account for some dimensions of variation that cluster around impulsivity, risk-taking, and a tendency to be, let's say, more more restricted in let's say sexually restricted and more kind of socially cooperative versus more unrestricted and less cooperative or more, say, exploitative in a number of ways. So that's one dimension. Does it explain everything about personality? Absolutely not. So it leaves out a lot of detail, a lot of interesting detail. But if it works, you have one kind of let's say big picture concept that might actually help you. You can apply it to disorders and see, okay, do they correlate with these traits, and and do they cluster in meaningful ways as they correlate with these traits? The idea here is to use this heuristic, really, of a fast versus low dimension of variation to make sense of patterns of covariation and also the risk factors. So if that is true, you expect for a number of reasons, some environmental but some genetic. So it's not a completely environmentalist approach, that people with like faster, let's say, combination of traits, so more, again, impulsive, risk-taking, more exploitative, sexually unrestricted, that will be associated by and large with environments that are more risky and dangerous and kind of lower quality and so forth, and vice versa. So then you can look at disorders and see if that's the case, because some mental disorders actually are associated with this kind of environment, right? Chaotic, risky, let's say problematic environments. But then other disorders are not. There's and so most disorders actually tend to usually, bad things go together and good things go together. But a lot of things, there's some disorders that seem to be exceptions. For example, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which can be, again, so I'm suggesting in this model that it's a good candidate for being at the borderline between an adaptive strategy and maybe a disorder. So you could see that as what you were suggesting, like a tail of a distribution where you have kind of this constraint and conscientiousness, and you can take it sometimes to a pretty extreme level, and it's kind of still work for you. Can still work as a strategy. Of course, then you can't have too much. So it's probably at the borderline. So it's not like, oh, everything, OCPD is always an adaptive strategy. I wouldn't say that. I would say it's a good candidate for being something at the borderline there. Now, OCPD is interesting because it can be very debilitating for people. In terms of social relationships, people can be, extremely kind of from the perspective of well-being and mental health can be very distressing and very damaging. But at the same time, it doesn't go together with a lot of bad stuff. So it's not strongly associated with, say, early stress or early experiences of abuse and neglect. Actually, I think there's some evidence people with OCPD tend to actually I'd say earn a bit more on average. So it's not, you can be actually promoting some aspects of, success in some ways. So that disorder doesn't really fit what happens with most disorder. Autism is similar in the sense that there's, again, probably a lot of heterogeneity in there, but there's some, very inconsistent evidence about the epidemiological correlates. So that's, so what I think is the potential of this approach is that it gives you a map of personality. It's a partial map. It's not a map of all personality. Just one thing, it's kind of consider this fast versus slow as an initial, like the first thing you look at. So you can make sense of clusters of disorders. If it works, and I argue that, it's promising, you can make sense of the developmental patterns of some disorders, whether they arise, let's say, early in childhood or maybe in adolescence, and correlations with risk factors. And then, which is also something that kind of the holy grail of psychopathology is, everyone knows that a lot of the diagnoses are very mixed. So autism is probably not one thing. The genetics, I think, is pretty clear. It's not one thing. There's all sorts of there's different conditions in there. Schizophrenia is probably not one thing. What are the big players here? Well, depression is probably not one thing. I mean, it's probably one thing in a sense, but it can be. For example, there's some evidence that something that we describe as depression can be triggered by the immune system as part of an inflammatory response, for example, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of heterogeneity within the diagnostic categories we have. Now, you can try to sort it out in a number of ways, but potentially you could try to slice it in all sorts of ways. Empirically, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. This actually, genetics eventually will, I think, clarify some of those things. But right now, it's limiting it, actually, because in the bigger studies, you need the biggest samples you can find, essentially, for the GWAS. And so some studies of, for example, autism or schizophrenia, they actually don't make fine distinctions between, say, subtypes. Or so what you get from the study is something that maybe refers to different things which are squeezed together. And so even how you interpret some of the genetic evidence is a bit, you have to be careful, because it's maybe it's not one thing. So you're not looking at one condition or one specific. Okay, so if this initial kind of fast, low classification system works, it might give you leverage to distinguish between types of disorders within the same category. And the way you do it, you have, first thing, you have to put down some kind of reasonable list of traits that fit with these, broad patterns. And again, I talked about, impulsivity, risk-taking. There's things like, again, you can map it to some extent on broad personality traits like agreeableness and conscientiousness, stuff like that. And then try to use these as a tool to look into disorders and see if you can clip them, right, in a way that makes functional sense using these concepts. And sometimes it works, sometimes it's a partial, I think, success. For example, my proposal, which is provisional, almost everything about this book is very provisional in a sense. But for example, I'm proposing that if you look at autism as a broad spectrum of conditions, part of it, particularly the kind of autism with a higher IQ, not like we'll call high functioning, although they removed that from the DSM now. But a lot of those conditions are, again, there's a broad range from possibly adaptive to frankly maladaptive, so it's not one thing, but a major contribution there is some traits that I'm arguing can be part of a specialized behavioral strategy that fits with a slow kind of life history pattern. That's my proposal. However, that's kind of half of the story, and then you have a completely different subgroup, which is mostly driven by, as far as we understand, just by accumulation of deleterious mutations or new mutations arising. That doesn't really have anything to do with personality variations or pattern or individual differences. It's just very close to a pure dysfunction. It's just bad mutation or possibly even other factors like infections or developmental disturbances just interfere with brain development in a way that creates some kind of symptoms. And right now they're lumped together. So this is also to say that I don't think this fast and slow classification can explain everything. It's not like everything fits neatly in there. I mean, there would be okay. So maybe you could make an argument that this approach to classification is already kind of slightly, let's say, delusional in the sense that it's very broad, it's very ambitious. That's what I kind of say. I'm definitely not arguing that you can explain everything about psychopathology with this. I think it gives you leverage to make some broad distinctions between disorders. For example, I'm arguing that, well, that's not a new argument. Of course, people have been, I'm not claiming authorship for this. So for example, connections between, say, psychopathy or narcissism, even borderline personality traits, and faster clusters of traits that's been said for quite a long time. There's that. I'm arguing that most of what goes in psychosis is so schizophrenia and bipolar disorder is linked to this constellation of traits. And on the other side, you have again a certain kind of autism. It's not all of it. And then some disorders like OCPD, where you have disorder in which constraints is a very behavior constraints, very strong feature of it. And then I'm suggesting, which is kind of interesting, because people in doing empirical classification of disorders have struggled with eating disorders. Where do you put them? Where were they? They seem to they correlate with everything. So it's kind of very weird category if you're trying to be a taxonomist. It's very irritating because they don't fit very well. So I'm building on some work on personality and eating disorders to suggest that you actually have very it's a kind of symptom that can arise for very different reasons and in association with very different personality constellations. And some of that goes with more essentially kind of impulsive eating, and the correlation of this kind of, it can be, again, anorexia versus bulimia. That's the traditional category. It doesn't work very well because a lot of people cycle between the two, and they change. The nature of the symptoms changes over time depending on whether you're trying to control the symptoms or not. And so it's very unstable. So you try to understand, bulimic symptoms versus anorexic symptom. You don't go very far because it's not it's describing types of symptoms, but apparently not types of people. Mm-hmm. So of course, it can be useful in treatment because that's interesting, because whether a classification that makes sense is also useful in treatment, that depends. So it could be the case that you want to treat anorexic symptoms in a way regardless of the personality background. That's, it's quite possible. But if you want to make a taxonomy that's, that's reasonable, you probably want to split eating disorders into clusters. And so I'm suggesting there's a more kind of impulsive link to traits that are more kind of disinhibited and more, risky behaviors. There's also correlations with externalizing traits, like again, conduct disorders or attention-seeking behaviors. And then on the other hand, you have some people who develop eating disorders, but the profile is very different. It's a kind of constrained profile with high conscientiousness. Also, the motivation for the symptoms might be slightly different, and I argue that it's connected with different kind of mating priorities. So in one case, it might be driven more strongly by because I'm talking about the onset of the symptoms, so how you get into eating disorders, more by concern with body attractiveness and body shape, and in other cases you have this more kind of moral, really more of a moral coloring of it in terms of being perfect and being, so this perfectionism, being perfect and being taking also a lot of pride in being able to control yourself and control your instincts and control your hunger. And I'm arguing that they really do go in different parts of the taxonomy. And again, it's not all original. I didn't do this work on personality disorders, but it's kind of interesting that if you look at other approaches to psychopathology, like the transdiagnostic dimensional approach, eating disorders are a bit of an oddball. So they're kind of moving one side or the other, like tricky to figure out, and partly because that model doesn't have a functional theory of why you would expect it. And the functional background I'm proposing is that eating disorders are mostly very strongly female biased, and they can arise in connection. I'm not saying they are an adaptive strategy. We want to talk about that maybe later and realize what are disorders from an evolutionary perspective. That's actually a very big question, and I think it's important to address. But connected somehow to mating, and particularly to so if you're more into, say, short-term mating or slightly more promiscuous mating styles, some aspects of physical attractiveness are particularly important, and that can be a very pressing concern from a motivational point of view. That is not an automatic pathway to eating disorders, but it constitutes a risk factor. It's a possible pathway in that direction. On the other hand, I would argue that the kind of eating symptoms associated with a slow end of this continuum have a slightly different motivational background. So they have, again, more to do with constraints and kind of moral display, probably to the extent that they have connections with mating. It seems to be more of kind of the constellation of behaviors that go with long-term mating, in terms of even suppressing fertility to some extent, although that I'm not saying this is an adaptive feature, but in terms of the links to functional things that can happen in people with a slower versus faster constellation of traits, I think it actually gives you leverage, not just to empirically split them, but also to make sense of some connections with, say, again, could be developmental trajectories and sexual behavior and things that people have been studying, but they have not been connecting together. Hopefully I began to answer your question. But that's the fast slow thing. And then there's a bunch of disorders that are very prevalent, and they don't really fit this taxonomy. And I tried initially to fit them in the taxonomy, and then I gave up. Essentially, I kind of realized it was actually best to split them in different dimensions. And that would be, again, I call them, but it's just a label, the defense activation disorder. Most of that is stuff that people would call internalizing disorder. So what is that? It's depression, anxiety, phobias, post-traumatic stress, things like that. So the reason for calling that defense activation disorder, I think, which I prefer the label, is that internalizing is not a very functional term. So the idea is that it's kind of, self-harming, but you have a problem, and it's reflected in your internal states, like again becoming depressed or anxious or dysphoric. And what people link them to usually is negative emotionality, which is correct. I mean, that's obviously true. The point is, what is negative emotionality? And what I'm taking from Randy Nesse has worked a lot on that, is no kind of major inspiration. But the idea that a lot of negative emotions, can be understood much better from a functional perspective if you think of them as parts of defensive systems, not in the psychoanalytic meaning of the term necessarily, but in the sense that, for example, disgust is a defense of the organism against contamination. Or infections. Fear is a defense against, protection against, various sources of physical danger. And shame, then you can extend it to social emotional shame, and you can think of shame as actually a protective emotion that deals with, social rejection, social judgment, and it constrains your behavior in a way that will not get you basically kicked out of your group or killed by a group or something like that. So same for depression. I mean, there's lots of interesting model of depression in which again, not very detailed models, but in general sense, the idea of lowering your mood and lowering your striving for goals and reward, and kind of down-regulating the striving and seeking part of behavior can be actually adaptive as when you're in a certain set of situations in which basically things are not working, your behavior is not working, you're making things worse by trying to reach your goals. It may actually make sense to stop basically doing what you're doing, kind of refocus, and then that, of course, that might get out of hand. But so these are yet a lot of negative emotions can be reframed as defenses, as adaptive defenses. And there are different reasons why those could go with different types of personality traits. And then again, it's not very specific. That's the reason for taking it out from this fast and slow dichotomy and treating them as a cluster by itself. Because again, you can think, if the functional story there in terms of predisposition, and then of course you have specific genetic factors, specific experiences. That's actually, these disorders are where you have the strongest evidence for a role of individual experiences, for depression and anxiety and so forth. Actually, you can, there's really good evidence that what happens to you in pretty specific ways can actually shape your, but there is a predisposition, obviously, to this kind of symptom. And if the predisposition is a readiness of your defenses in this specific, meaning to become activated in a vigorous way, let's say, or maybe remain activated for longer than usual. So let's say, most people get anxious. Some people get anxious and stay anxious. They have trouble disengaging from the anxiety, and maybe so that kind of, let's say, upregulation of defenses. There are reasons to think it could be associated with the faster patterns of personality and behavior, but there are also reasons to think they might be associated with some of slower patterns, because, for example, slower people who are, what is slow in this context? We're talking about people who tend to be, oriented to the long term, not impulsive, so it's kind of mindful, future oriented, risk avoidant. They don't like to take risk, very. So in many cases, you have this association with, say, prosociality and kind of affiliation, and so you're very concerned about what other people are thinking of you. You're very sensitive about the state of your social relationship, your affiliative relationship. So all of those things, in this context, it makes sense that you will be sensitive to threats to your long-term welfare. And actually, there, for example, becoming anxious in a kind of preventative sense. So on the other hand, if you actually, are, let's say, impulsive, risk-seeking, kind of, your environment is actually probably full of trouble, and that might contribute to shape the symptoms in some people. So those traits in some people. But regardless, you're going to create trouble around yourself. So it actually makes sense that you might be, ready to detect danger and immediate danger, so you can expect some. So the general idea boils down to the principle that these so disorders that are functionally linked to this upregulation of defenses, again, depression, anxiety, phobias, and so forth, you probably don't expect a strong specificity with respect to these other personality traits. There might be a little correlation on the fast side, but it doesn't make sense to lump them together with that. And it also, it opens up a nice little space, because you have, fast and slow in this defense. I actually have this graph, with three blobs, but then there's room for another blob down there, which would be, again, kind of enigmatic category. But again, people have suggested repeatedly that there might be some things that we maybe should describe as disorders, where actually your emotional defenses against dangers are abnormally low. So people are not being too little, they experience too little, say, anxiety and fear and worry and so forth. And we don't have, so the DSM doesn't really have conditions that you could classify this way, which of course links to the problem of how you define a disorder. And I don't know if you want to go there, but if you want to go there, I agree mostly with Jerome Wakefield, the idea that a disorder is really not a natural kind. There's not something in nature that we actually call, should be called disorder, and there's a hard line, what is a disorder, what's not. So there's, what he proposes, like the disorders strictly defined are things where there's a dysfunction. That's the objective. So if you understand the function of the system, then you can see, okay, it's not functioning as it should now. It's not functioning as it's designed to function. But to have something that you would call a disorder, you also need some kind of judgment that it's being harmful to the person or to society. And that part is not in the mechanism itself. It's some kind of judgment. It could change. Things that are considered disorders in one place in time might not be considered disorder in different place of time. And I buy it, some people are very critical of this argument, so there's a lot of debate. I try to change my opinions over time, but I kind of circle back to this idea, and I think it's very powerful, very, very true. So it means that some things that might actually be dysfunction in a strict sense will never be really recognized as disorders because they don't have this harmful perception. So people who are, for example, say people are abnormally carefree and they're not anxious, they actually have a serious problem, they don't get scared when they really kind of should, in a sense. I mean, we could map this and maybe we have evidence that no, their system is not just an adaptive extreme of distribution, there's actually something broken in their fear system. It's not, let's say we could say that, which is very tricky to do because defenses are weird. So when we're talking about defenses, it's actually, and again, Randy Nesse has, does some good theory about the smoke detector principle and how you should set. So actually defenses might be designed to fail at certain conditions. So it's not, failure is not evidence of maladaptation for defenses. It's again very tricky kind of mechanism. But if we had evidence that this kind of behavior is a broken mechanism, still people might just not come to see it as a disorder, and so it will never end up in the DSM. You see what I mean? So so the fact that there's a missing spot in there, people have remarked on this for a disorder that reflect mainly the insufficient activation of defenses. It's probably not a coincidence that there's a blank spot in there, because it's probably, if people actually have that condition, that why not? There might be. It would be strange if there wasn't something like that. It wouldn't probably be seen as a disorder because it doesn't appear harmful or doesn't feel harmful. And the one condition that I found in the DSM that could be mapped in this way, and I don't remember the exact, but it's basically children who are indiscriminate in their attachment behavior. So they don't fear strangers, they attach to stranger in the city, and that is actually I will let you know. But anyways, that kind of thing is actually classified as a disorder in a DSM, and the reason it's because socially we recognize that that's putting children in danger. That's a harmful component. But for adults, we don't have this perception that adults who are fearless and end up doing stupid things because they don't have emotional defenses are, we should protect them. So no disorders. But anyways, so it's an interesting, so it could be eventually that, so people have suggested that if we focus more on the dysfunction part, so if you start redefining disorders more narrowly, and we require evidence of dysfunction before we classify them as disorders, we should be filling up that spot. And maybe some disorders that seem, are currently in the DSM, they should be taken out because they're, not dysfunctions. Maybe they're just functional variants. If Wakefield is right, that the way we think about disorders really is not really just about dysfunction, but it's more broad. And even beyond Wakefield, there might be some things that we all agree they're not dysfunctions, but we want to do something about them anyway. So let's say, blood pressure. Now it's tricky. Let's say your blood pressure is a bit high. Is that a dysfunction? I mean, probably not, right? I mean, there's probably some parts of the spectrum where you can make an argument that it's not working properly. There's going to be a whole range of blood pressure in which it's still a normal variant, and so you go to your doctor. They're like, okay, you have this blood pressure, it's high, and it's like, okay, what do I do about it? Well, it's probably an adaptive variant, and there's a trade-off. So you're risking more. I know I'm just making it up, so don't but you're risking more heart disease, but it's protecting you from these and these other disorders. So just go home and be happy. You're like, wait, can't I do anything? Anything about it? And so I'm suspecting that even over time, even if we get more biological in our definition of disorders, there will be room for things that are, strictly speaking, not disorders in terms of dysfunction, but we still want to kind of consider them as disorders because we want to do something about it. And at the same time, there will be things that actually we can show that they are dysfunctions that will never get in the diagnostic systems because people don't perceive them as diseases. So, okay, yeah. What do you think about that? What the definition of disorder? Because you've talked to other evolutionary psychologists and psychiatrists. So, what's your perception of this debate? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess that it's a bit complicated because, I mean, you referred to several different things there. And I guess that one of the most interesting, or at least one that I find the most interesting of them all, because I've also talked on my show with a philosopher of psychiatry, and at a certain point there you were referring to the fact that there's always a moral component to how we classify disorders.
Right.
Some of them, historically speaking, for example, in the case of even homosexuality, for example, it has been considered a mental disorder until recently, at least in certain parts of the globe, and it was basically social condemnation of people that were homosexual in that case. So I guess that, I mean, there's the component of evolutionary psychology about trying to understand why the behaviors that are associated with certain things that we classify as disorders, certain clusters of behaviors have evolved, and if they are adaptations or if they are byproducts of adaptations, or if it's just the fact that there are a certain percentage of people where certain rare mutations occur, or for example, there's negative selection on certain mutations, but then because people keep reproducing, new ones come on board, and then that would be one of the reasons why, for example, there are certain conditions like schizophrenia that I guess occur on around 1% of the population, or at least the full-fledged version of it. And I mean, that percentage would not decrease even though there's negative selection on it, because new mutations will
There's
keep popping up all
selection
the time.
balance. Yeah. Right.
I mean, so I guess that there are several different ways that we can tackle
the
question.
Sure. I was wondering if you had any particular, question on that. So maybe one thing I can say is kind of, I think it's important whenever you're linking, evolution and disorders. And this is probably for evolutionary medicine too. So, so one thing it's a misunderstanding to some extent of the field, but the idea that when you're making a functional argument, because what I'm saying is we can try to rebuild or at least build an interesting, useful classification of disorders based on functional principles. And the functional principles would be some ideas derived with some difficulty from life history theory about patterns of behaviors and trade-offs and so forth. That's a functional approach. But what a lot of people hear is that now you're thinking that disorders are functional. So this kind of hyper adaptationist. So they're not disorders, they're actually adaptive strategies. And so it's probably useful to restate that that's not what I mean at all. So what I'm saying is that different disorders tend to be correlated with patterns of individual differences. And if you can make sense of those patterns that are functional in the sense that they reflect some, again, trade-offs, cost and benefits, and allocations of the organism, then you can maybe make sense of things like, again, the developmental patterns, risk factors, comorbidities, and so forth. The disorders themselves, well, that's very tricky. And I think, the paradox is, a lot of people think that an evolutionary approach is kind of a one size fits all, right? Everything is an adaptation, everything is a strategy. Okay, what I really think is that an evolutionary approach gives you a view of disorders that's much more differentiated and more richer than most of the competition, really. And so because you have lots of it gives you better grounding in thinking about how things can go wrong in various ways. And you can go all the way from things that are actually strategies in an adaptive sense in terms of survival and reproduction and eventually inclusive fitness, but still they have some downsides and social costs and whatever, or maybe, and so we see them as disorders even if they're adaptive. You can make the case, for example, for psychopathy, at least certain variants of it might fit the bill, or anyways. But then you have some pure dysfunctions, things that are just, and you can find good evidence that there's some mechanism that regulates behavior that gets disrupted by could be mutations, could be infections, could be experiences that are just too stressful to bear, maybe in combination with some vulnerability that was pre-existing, and then you can actually have an understanding of the mechanism. You can show that it's just not working as it usually does, and it's kind of broken or dysregulated. In the middle of that, there is an incredibly long spectrum of things. You have mismatches, where again people argue whether should be often think of mismatches. Maybe it's kind of a rare thing. I won't go there, but things that were adaptive might not be adaptive anymore. So there's kind of a tension. So maybe it's a trait that used to promote fitness and now it doesn't. But you can see ways in which you actually could have fitness even if you have some costs. And now maybe the costs have come to outweigh the benefits. So you want to treat it. And then you have
Could I
Yeah,
just
sure. Oh,
interrupt
yeah,
you
sure,
there?
absolutely.
Because there's a very interesting idea that just came to my
Yeah,
mind.
yeah.
Because I mean, the several different ways we classify disorders, and you
Hmm.
referred to
Yeah,
evolutionary mismatch,
sure.
and one of the things that came to my mind was, so it could be the case that it would also be important for us to classify certain clusters of behaviors as disorders
Hmm.
because people in the environments that we have created,
Hmm.
if they have that kind of profile, let's
Hmm.
say, they are dysfunctional, and
Hmm.
they
Hmm.
wouldn't be dysfunctional from an evolutionary perspective if
Hmm.
they
Hmm.
lived, for example, in a more traditional
Hmm.
society like
Hmm.
an hunter-gatherer society or
Hmm.
something like that. But because we created these modern
Hmm.
environments, and people to survive in
Hmm.
these environments have to do this and that
Sure,
and be
sure, sure.
exposed to these conditions, then in this particular context they would be dysfunctional.
Hmm. Oh, sure. I mean, it's, again, defining a disorder again is not, it's not something that can be done completely objective. So if you buy this idea that the disorder is kind of a, there's a subjective component that you can't really take out, then of course things like that will, but no, definitely. And it's probably the case with some things, but yeah, I mean, on the other hand, uh, one thing about mismatches, since you brought it up, is well, mismatch to some extent is just what happens all the time. So environments change, organisms co-evolve with one another. So it's not like there's an organism just matched to the environment and it just maybe there's some exceptions like we have this stability over a long time, but in general, so these are every time you have major changes in social conditions or technological conditions, there will be traits that were more useful before and become less useful from a fitness perspective, and vice versa. So sure, it's probably important to realize that mismatch is not just this kind of unusual and bizarre thing that happens sometimes, but to some extent it's kind of the normal condition of organisms. There's and actually mismatch is what drives evolution forward to some extent. So, right, and then adding to that, so then you have trade-offs. So sometimes mechanisms can't do everything. You have to in a way make decisions, and so being more predisposed to some kinds of disorders may actually make you less predisposed to other kinds of disorders. And people are starting to find this in medicine as well. And trade-offs can have bad consequences, at least from the perspective of well-being and mental health. Also learning, that's another interesting aspect. So a lot of I it's a lot of the kind of standard approaches to psychopathology, like psychotherapy, let's say psychotherapy approaches, the assumption is that there's some kind of maladaptive learning. You're learning, I don't know, let's say counterproductive cognitions or ideas about yourself, expectations about the world, a way of regulating your emotions that are counterproductive or kind of backfire. So this kind of maladaptive learning idea. And the thing is, if you take an evolutionary approach to learning, and there's a whole section of evolutionary theory that deals with how organisms can learn from the environment. Well, that's you get some interesting insights, because those models will tell you that learning. First thing, the learning can't always work. I mean, you're always making trade-offs even in learning. So if for example, you want to be more flexible, sometimes you will be more susceptible to errors. If you want to be more conservative in your learning, then you're missing out on some opportunities. Learning adaptively can actually get you into some blind spots. So even if you're, let's say, an optimal learner, right, about your environment, I mean, you might end up in points where you actually kind of learn the wrong thing about the environment and you get stuck in vicious circles. So your behavior will be maladaptive, even if your learning systems are optimally designed. So this thing about the trade-offs involved in learning and managing social information. So for example, do you want to trust people? Be very trustful and just believe what they tell you? That's dangerous, very dangerous in certain ways. Do you want to be mistrustful? Maybe be a bit paranoid, but those are, the thing is, there's not one best way to do it, right? There's really cost and benefits and so on. So there's that developmental processes can, are tuned in a certain way, and to the extent they're sensitive to the environment, there's a risk of maladaptations and so on. So there's the big picture. It's really a spectrum of many, many different ways in which, on the one hand, adaptive mechanisms can break down and get dysregulated, or when for different reasons which have to do with evolutionary changes over evolutionary time, or changes over developmental time, or just the trade-offs and compromises that you inevitably have in regulating complex behavior, things can get you to a point where it's either maladaptive or maybe still adaptive but undesirable from a subjective perspective. And then you have the other extremes in which you have some conditions that are in fact biologically adaptive, in the sense that you will maybe reproduce, and maybe your all thing included, your fitness is positive. There's maybe positive selection on it, at least at certain times at certain places, but it's still socially regarded as not so good, for example, because it hurts other people, mostly because it hurts other people. Like you could say narcissists do pretty well in a number of ways, even extreme narcissists, not in the long term, but they maybe don't need to. It can be at the same time, let's say society agrees that we treat that as a disorder, and I think there's a reason for that. It's not completely arbitrary, but there's a whole spectrum, and I actually think that, especially compared with, there's an approach to psychopathology that tries to be as atheoretical as possible, and it's less concerned with the cause of disorders and the etiology of disorders, more concerned with mapping them and describing them. But then other approaches have tried to explain disorders. Cognitive, people who do cognitive therapy, there's a background of explanation. There's an explanatory background. How do disorders arise? How do people get to be depressed, or to be phobic, or to be this and that, and so on. For psychoanalysis and other major approaches have tried to explain disorders, and usually they tend to again, my hunch is because they don't have a solid, grounded theory of what the mind and behavior is for and how it evolves. They tend to eventually narrow down to kind of one explanation for pretty much everything, or most things. And it's, I don't see, I'm thinking of exceptions right now to kind of contradict myself, but so for example, if you talk to, I think case in point, talk to Stephen Hayes, and so ACT, I think, by the way, is a very sensible approach to therapy, but in terms of the etiology, I think it's very narrow, because you have a lot of people arguing that basically, how do you call them, experiential avoidance, right, is basically the main cause of mental suffering. So there's, it's kind of, and it's about, it's a very kind of behavioristic approach to psychopathology. So the whole idea there is that you learn from, again, contingencies, and then, relational learning and so forth. But basically you learn from the environment, sometimes you get stuck into bad learning, maladaptive learning, and you avoid your feelings and so forth, and that's the pathway to different types of psychopathology. So, and I think it's in a valid description in some cases, but I just bring an example of something it's not old-fashioned. What I'm saying is not like a clinical theory of 100 years ago. It's stuff that's current now, and people are teaching and learning. And it strikes me how kind of in the broad landscape of all the possible things that can give rise to a disorder, it concerns itself with a very narrow slice of it. So I actually think an evolutionary approach has a counterintuitive or surprising virtue of really alerting you to the fact that disorders are definitely not one thing. There's not one kind of process. There's all sorts of ways organisms can be designed in a way that makes them vulnerable. And sometimes vulnerabilities are real, sometimes are apparent, and they're not really vulnerabilities. And this idea of trade-offs is also something that's very hard for, well, in medicine as a whole. I think that's the one concept that, let's say, standard mainstream medicine really struggle with these trade-offs. And the same for psychiatry and clinical psychology. There's this idea that you can, at least, I don't think so much in therapy. That's the funny thing. In therapy, people are not really trying to get perfect. You want to manage. You learn to manage, your emotions, your environment in a way that makes more sense. But trade-offs are the stuff of this kind of, if you want to become more in a certain way, you will be less in a certain way. You pay some costs. It's always like that. But the theories usually don't incorporate these in a deep way. Theories and so there is a certain kind of disconnection between the theories about the origin of disorders and then the way you actually treat them. That's kind of interesting. And I think, again, more grounding in this idea that organisms have to, struggle with competing goals. Each goal has slightly different, rules and requirements, so on. There's, individual differences are real. They are a result of a complex history of selection, in which different factors might contribute. Development is again intricate. We don't quite understand development. That's I think true. If you put this all together, it actually gives you, I think, maybe it's just me, but it's a very let's say realistic background. And on this background, you can then, entertain different hypotheses. So it doesn't guide you. It doesn't tell you what, what is schizophrenia? Well, I don't know. Could be a number of things. It definitely looks like it's a dysfunction in a number of ways. There's also evidence that a predisposition to psychosis can have some benefits. We still don't know exactly the evolutionary history of the genes that are involved in that. But then you can explore, but as you explore, I think you'll be grounded in a rich and realistic view of what you're talking about, which is essentially human beings, social primates that do certain things and have been selected in a certain environment that has certain, motivations and some. So that's, I think, where it boils down to. And if everything in this book, I wrote turns out to be wrong, which is a possibility. Again, I think it's worth exploring. So, for example, this classification system I'm proposing, again, it's tricky because it's not, oh yeah, you have a checklist, and when you have these 10 things, then it's tricky because, you have issues of measurement, issues, sometimes the benefit of a trait can be apparent in people who have a predisposition to the disorder, but not in people who have the disorder. So for schizophrenia, for example, it's just, people who have a kind of low-level psychotic symptoms, those people tend to be more creative. There's some evidence they can be more kind of sexually attractive, and this is the basis for some of the things I'm saying. If you look at people with schizophrenia, they don't have these qualities. Usually they're less creative, there's lower IQ, they're not very sexually attractive. So if you just look at the disorder, you get a very different picture. So it's a very long and convoluted process to actually get to, and you need some guiding principles. So I'm putting forward this kind of fast, low defense classification as a possibly useful guiding principle. I think you can make progress, and then we'll see. But I think what's going to stay about the evolutionary approach is really I think you're right to emphasize motivation, because that's something that is kind of, it's everywhere. So, everyone who does, psychotherapy, or obviously you're dealing with motivations all the time. That's, where emotions come from. So, it's almost, obvious that motivations are an important part of what you're doing. But models of psychopathology, they usually don't have a reasonable or solid theory of motivation. And even models of psychopathology are based on affective processes. internalizing, externalizing, and so forth. They end at the level of the emotions and don't ask the question, okay, where did this emotion come from? What systems are producing this emotion? So it's kind of a gap, and it's a bit everywhere. So that's going to stay, I think. And the other thing is, I think an evolutionary approach to psychopathology, but also to medicine more, like disorders more broadly, really opens your mind to the fact that disorders can arise in a multitude of ways. They're not, they're really not one thing. In a way, we all know that, it seems like a very intuitive idea. But if you look at how people theorize about, mental disorder, for example, that's not the way they think. There's usually a tendency to find, okay, what's the cause for disorders? So and otherwise they're like, okay, the other approach is very unsatisfying, so unsatisfying. They'll say, okay, let's take a biopsychosocial perspective. And so, okay, there's biological factors, but there's also, psychological factors, and there's social factors, blah, 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 all together. And then you don't understand that, even a bit better than, because it's generic. That's the thing. So you want to be open to a multitude of processes, but also have enough ground that you can actually map them. And that, I think, is probably the main contribution of an evolutionary outlook on psychopathology.
Okay, so do you think that we should end on that note? We've already done more than 2 hours.
I think, yeah, no, I know. It's, I think we might. If you have any, closing question or I'm happy to.
I think we've already run through basically all of my questions, all of the questions that I've prepared. We've already touched on most of the main topics of your book, right? Oh, by the way, before we go, there's the book. What are the best places on the internet for people to find your work, generally?
Oh, okay. Well, I have a website. So I have a personal website, and it has my publications, links to all my work. So that's probably it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I will be leaving links to your work in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out, and also for the book. And it was really a pleasure to have you on the show and to talk to you. It was a really interesting conversation. So.
Yes. Okay. Take care.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been doing regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep this channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, you can also support me via Subscribestar or PayPal. And please share the video, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and PayPal supporters, Karin Litska, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, Janne Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Gidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Annie Ankata, Jacob Klinkby, Dr. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingart, and also my 3 producers, Isar Webbe, Rosie, and Jim Frank. Thank you for all.